All right, welcome everyone. Very excited to be here. My name is Gal Raz. I'm a professor of operation and sustainability. I've been doing work in the last, I would say, couple of decades related to sustainable operations, looking at issues of innovation, sustainability, how firms make decisions, as well as how governments make decisions about incentives for firms related to sustainability, and how it reacts to consumers. So how consumers react to those decisions by the governments and firms. And specifically, I've looked at the issues of EVs and government incentive for EVs, both firms' incentives as well as consumer incentives and trade-offs between them. And today we have a great panel, which I'll introduce in a second, but just to give you a bit of context, and I should say also, I mean, it's been a week, but until last week I was also Associate Dean of Research for Ivy, so I'm very passionate about the critical issues. I've been leading the critical issues kind of as part of our strategy, and especially about sustainability, which is my core research for a while. So just to give you a bit of a kind of context to what we are talking about today. So as you probably, some of you know, Canada set an ambitious target of 20% of all vehicles sold domestically by 2026. 3 years away, where 2024 is just around the corner, so I would say almost 2 years away, increasing to 60% by 2030 and 100% by 2035. Many G7 nations have the same goal, and one of the clear kind of, start, I would say, of an arms race occurred last year when the US came out with the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, the largest single fiscal appropriation for climate funding, so a lot of subsidies, kind of rebates, really government taking leadership on that aspect kind of in the US. And I think that created many people and many governments to think, what can we do and what should we be doing? And our kind of question for today is what is Canada doing, first of all? So are we doing enough things? What are the challenges kind of and opportunities? What should be Canada doing in order to become, I would say, both a leader in EV as well as making sure that this is something that is becoming central to our economy. So that's going to be my kind of our discussion today. And for this, I have three esteemed colleagues that joined us today that I would like to introduce. So Rachel Duran, kind of on the first chair, currently serves as Vice President of Policy and Strategy at Clean Energy Canada. Prior to joining the organization, Rachel served as a Senior Special Advisor to the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, advisor to the Prime Minister and Chief of Staff to Ministers of Justice and Indigenous Services. Rasika, I'm gonna try not to butcher your last name, Ramuthula. Is that okay? Okay, great. We spend a lot of time at Ivy to try to learn our students' name and try to pronounce them, but it's not always easy. But I know as somebody who's everybody butchering my simple name, I know how kind of problematic it is. So Rasika led the government and regulatory affairs for Volkswagen Group Canada since 2011, championed the sustainability agenda. In 2019, Rasika steered the funding of Electrify Canada to support ultra-fast and convenience charging in collaboration with Electrify America. And prior to that, she worked for federal regulators in Ottawa. So looking forward to our discussion. And Flavio Volpe has been proudly led the APMA since 2014, representing 200 plus suppliers to the worldwide automotive industry. In 2022, he was named to the Ontario Premier Council on U.S. Trade and Competitiveness. In response to the Prime Minister's challenge for a net zero economy by 2050, Flavio spearheaded an all-Canadian zero-emission autonomous concept prototype, Project Aero, which I'm sure we're going to hear more about today. I had a chance to see it when I came to your conference earlier, kind of in September, which was also wonderful to see your discussion with the Prime Minister. So probably talk more about that. So before I'll go to our esteemed kind of speakers, I would just want to give you a bit of a context. Just where we are kind of, so we're academic, we need to present some slides and some data and some information before we can start. So transportation, first of all, as we know, is one of the big contributors for GHG emissions. So 22% of Canada's total emission coming from transportation. And as we said, Canada pledged to reduce GHG emission by 40% below 2005 levels by 2030 and net zero emission by 2050, hence the pledge that we had earlier about kind of, EVs that we're having. I would say Canada is still behind. I would love to hear kind of, our panelists about that. But I think that when you look overall, there's been a big growth in the last decade from basically 0.1% to 15% of total new vehicles going in for EVs. Canada is around 10% kind of in 2023. And it's interesting, especially because Canada is so rich in natural resources. So I'm trying to think, I'm originally operations, kind of my bread and butter supply chain management. So on the supply side, Canada is very strong with rich natural resources and critical minerals, manufacturing footprint, kind of, especially in the auto industry. And also for adoption, we have a lot of different kind of government regulations. So there is a question, what should Canada be doing? And just to give you, I'm going to put it out there. I'm not going to kind of get too much, but I'm going to highlight a couple of things specifically, and I hope we'll get a chance to talk about permitting and approval processes for mining. As somebody who is also one of my citizenship is Australian, I lived there for about 5 years. I still understand why it takes 21 months in Australia and could take 10 to 20 years here to approve a mining project, which is obviously a big issue. I think the other issue is the charging and infrastructure. If you look at what the goal is and how much we have to get into infrastructure in the next kind of 10, 20 years, by 2025, the expectation is 1 of 49 vehicles kind of by 2050 and 20 EVs by 2025. We're talking about much more of the infrastructure that we have today. So the question is, how do we get there from the adoption side, from the infrastructure side? How do we get to what is needed for customers to adopt? And that is obviously one of the big issues. So let me start with you, Rachel, and what do you see as the main challenges that Canada is facing and that we should be working in the next kind of 3 years to 7 years, kind of until 2030?
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity. I'm interested to hear where my colleagues head with this. But I think before we dig too far into the challenges, you've highlighted a few things around where Canada is in relation to the rest of the world. And I think one of the things that we all need to acknowledge is the world is on a trajectory. And if we're looking at technological adoption and the kinds of S-curves that these things follow, Canada now is among a number of countries that have hit a 5% battery electric vehicle emissions sales standard, after which we've watched in other countries the trajectory really take off. So we're watching kind of between the early adopters who are dealing with the really patchy times where people are still figuring out how things go, and now hitting doubling in the course of the last year from that kind of 5% standard to 10% standard. That isn't to say this is a percentage of new vehicles. So of vehicles on the road, electric vehicles are still very small. And I think Canada's ranking about in the middle of the pack. So there was a recent study just released on EV readiness in 20 countries. Canada moved up from 13th last year to 9th this year. That means there's things to do on the supply side, on the demand side, on the policy side to really get ready. I think some of the excitement around EVs in Canada is really our potential for this to be a huge boon, not only to kind of business and the supply chain, but to consumers. So we released a study last year looking at the potential for the Canadian economy and found there was up to $48 billion and hundreds of thousands of jobs available in Canada if the right policies were put in place to try to really take advantage of this opportunity. And then, as you've indicated, Gal, the United States drops a bomb out of nowhere, which kind of starts hoovering up investment south of the border. So I think we're really still reeling a bit in Canada and figuring out how to respond to that. And given we're a small, open economy, how to do that with less resources at disposal, kind of reactive policies. And so I think what I expect to hear from colleagues on the stage here is Canada needs to be moving faster and acting with an urgency that really responds to the level of opportunity. Because right now we're looking at an overall EV supply chain globally that's measured at $1.7 trillion in investments. Out to 2030, it's estimated that could be 8.8 trillion. Out to 2050, as high as 88 trillion. So there is money here. Canada has great resources, critical minerals, good labor, clean electricity. I'm sure Rasika will talk about reasons why Volkswagen has chosen to locate here. But there are challenges, as you've laid out, Gal, in terms of how are we getting those critical minerals online? How are we ensuring that producers have a clear line of sight into the kinds of tax advantages and incentives that they're going to receive vis-a-vis other jurisdictions? But maybe because I'm always the glass half full person on the panel, I'll also say, I think there's an advantage to consumers. And we did a study this fall, which really looked at how much, looking at the incentives available today across Canada, and taking into consideration the amount of life over the lifetime of a 10-year vehicle ownership cycle, how much an electric vehicle is going to save you. And based on current incentives, there are vehicles that are paying off today within the first year. And then you were saving every year after that, driving it for 10 years. In one case, we measured sort of a comparable vehicle of a Bolt, and I think it was a Toyota, but don't quote me on that one. We were looking at $33,000 of savings over 10 years of ownership. That buys you an entire other car. So I think, we'll get into myths and facts and other pieces, but one thing I think we all need to hold kind of as a truth is there's a reason behind this shift, and it isn't just government policy. There are real advantages that are out there in terms of the shift to electric vehicles, and I think it's really exciting to see the Canadian companies that are really pivoting into that space because of the opportunities that are going to be there. So maybe I'll leave it there and respond to what my colleagues say.
Hey, thanks, Rachel. Rasika, what are your thoughts?
Sure. So I think from like a manufacturer perspective, well, we have the fun task of hitting that 100% by 2035 task, which is only 12 short years away. And especially when it comes to infrastructure, which is what I would highlight as the critical challenge that I see, because 12 years is a very short timeline when it comes to infrastructure in Canada. So, and I look at I know Rachel mentioned there's other countries where you've seen S-curve adoption much faster, but they got very tactical and they might have had a much more smaller landmass, but they were very tactical in how they approached charging. So if I look at making sure we keep the customer at the heart of the equation here, because people have to remember 100% of new car sales means a sale is a transaction between a company and a person, a willing customer. And to get that confidence up that, hey, I should switch to electric, the real perk is having a residential charger at home. So you're leaving your house every day with a full tank and you never have to see a gas station again. So, but yet Canada is much more urbanized than the US, and we're a big country. So Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal have a whole bunch of new build condos coming up right now and new housing. We're in a rush to produce affordable housing, but I see a regional issue where some cities are more progressive on making sure parking, the parking spots are rough and ready. But if you want 100% of Canada to be EV ready by 2035 and have that steep adoption curve, we need those regulations here and now. And it's 6 times cheaper to build it right the first time and have it roughed and ready than it is to try and retrofit something after the fact. Also, to keep the customer at the heart of it, I would love to see more sustainable solutions that are a real tax incentive to the customer. So for anyone fronting their own money to put in a home charger, or especially in your condos, but also in your residential homes, having it maybe a tax break for Canadians, because we need a reason to help solve for the residential, and that actually alleviates a little bit more of the burden on the public charging infrastructure that we'll need, but we'll still need a lot of that as well. So we need, Canada's done a good job of doing the numbers game on chargers, which means there's been a lot of 50 kilowatts starting to spread randomly across the country, but maybe not in the right locations and in the right use cases, right? I don't know why the LCBO needs chargers that take 4 to 6 hours for a charge, right? So that money could have been spent in a lot. I don't know anybody who spends that long on LCBO, and if we do, we have bigger problems as a society. So I think where I would love to see is the real future is 350 kilowatts at any place where people spend 20 minutes or less, because we are a very time impatient society now, driven by convenience. So we need to remember that. We need to convince the consumers. And so 350 kilowatts is the future in public charging, except for maybe workplace and hotels where level 2 makes sense, or 50 kilowatts. So I think solving those infrastructure challenges today with all 3 levels of government, that needed to start yesterday, but at a minimum, we need a dragon boat approach and get those chargers in the ground.
Fabio.
We built a Canadian, all Canadian zero electric vehicle. You may have heard of it, Project Arrow. And what we did there was to turn around and say, the Canadian companies in the automotive space, with all apologies to my colleague on my left, who we work very well together,
Yes, we do.
happens to be domiciled in Germany. So the decisions get made in Wolfsburg. A lot of those align very well with Canadian industry expectations and objectives. But the Canadian companies are the suppliers. So how can we help move this space forward? Well, let's demonstrate that from bumper to bumper, in all of the hard plastic and metallic pieces to the applied technology, to the deep technology, you can source it anywhere you want here. We have 534 companies bid on a project for 1 car. 244 meet the due diligence, which was you have scalable, ready, commercially ready technology for the 2025 model year, and then 58 of them ultimately made the pass, and it's on the world tour. We're in Dubai at COP28 next month. Everybody's excited about it, and it's probably been the biggest surprises as we tell the Canadian story around the world, that vehicle, which works. It's a working prototype. We didn't build a clay model, costs $20 million. You can't have it unless you have $20 million for us.
So very cheap. You're solving the kind of the problem of affordability first of all, right? So
we're going to need more than just a federal incentive on that one. And before this, I built solar power plants in Ontario. And then those of you who lived through the Green Energy Act era know that there was a lot of hope, backed by a lot of government money, backed by some kind of weird regs that required some local content that weren't WTO friendly, that then got challenged and defeated by Japan and the EU, and then everybody got out of the business. I made some money in that time. I enjoyed it. And I got to walk around and tell people about how renewable energy sources are very important, and that we can convert everything but our base load there. But the reality of that discussion is that if you're going to convince a lender or an equity partner or a supplier to give you equitable terms, they've got to see a profit. That pro forma's got to work. So we're talking about EVs, and we're talking about how governments around the world are falling over each other to say, we're going to get to 100% EV purchases through mandates and targets and other funny systems by 2035. And then car companies falling over each other over the last 3 or 4 years say, I'm going to get there first. And I go around telling everybody saying, look, I believe in the technology. I think it's a superior product, period. In every way, even if you're just an auto enthusiast, which I am, they're faster, they're cleaner, they're better, they aren't cheaper. And in a city like this, 35% of the people in this city live in multifamily residences. We're not going to solve for that by 2035. And then when we say, even if we did, who's going to pay for it? Well, our current regulatory model is it goes through a public distribution company. That distribution company, like Toronto Hydro, has got to go to the OEB and say, well, we're going to invest $100 million in charging. And the OEB has to decide whether they can get that back through the rates at 9%. If they don't, they get a no. I say all of this because I say we're not going to get to 100% by 2035. We're not going to get close. We're going to get to 35 or 40%. Now, what does that mean for the industry? Well, we're going to get past the tipping point of where do you invest? You invest in zero-emission powertrains and zero-emission technologies, and then you cash cow the internal combustion engine products there. But the vehicle architecture is completely different. Just the way you design an interior is completely different. Those of you who've seen Project Arrow and you look at it and you say, how big is this on the inside? Well, it's because I don't have a transmission tunnel or an engine bay, and there's so many other things that we can do there. I just came back from Washington where we met with state, treasury, energy, congressional committees, the White House, and the Interior. And we said, while we have these targets with really big penalties, the Chinese have decided the best way to enter North America then is not through M&A activity, but to take a real shot at a winning market in Mexico. And in the last year, Chinese brands, who by the way make fabulous cars, they went from 5.7% of the market to 19.4% in 1 year. And then in terms of foreign direct investment in the supply chain, companies like Tesla, who, I'm not going to make any comment there. It's an American company.
You can tweet it later.
Yeah. It's an American company that is the leader in EVs, who relies heavily on expansion of its capacity in Mexico and the sourcing of its batteries and its raw materials for those batteries, sorry, not Mexico, China. And sourcing of those raw materials in China for those batteries has decided that it's going to invest in Monterrey as its next North American expansion, and has called for its Chinese suppliers to set up to supply them in Mexico. Now, why are they different? Rosica works for a market-driven company. I serve market-driven companies. When you have those discussions on progressing your technology to meet mandates, you always have to think about return. And if you don't have a strict relationship with return, you're not going to be able to make those management decisions to go into those segments, because you're going to kill the company. Well, the Chinese companies are state-owned, state-controlled, state-financed, who have what I call a 4,000-year arc. They don't have a tight relationship with return on investment. They are married to market acquisition. So we set up the USMCA to say, Fortress North America, we're going to do this together. Then the Americans set up the IRA and we matched them. Said we're going to do this together. We have a very tight outlook on M&A activity through Investment Review Act saying, no, you can't buy this mine. Governor of Nuevo León is saying, come over, make them here. And the last piece of that puzzle, which is going to be a very significant problem, is something that we just saw 2 weeks ago. The Chinese said, we control 65% of production in graphite. You need graphite for anodes. You need about 50 to 100 kilograms per electric vehicle. They go, we're not going to export anymore. How are you going to make electric cars unless you right away find more graphite? You know, it speaks to your mining taste. It's a shot across the bow. It's, if you're going to beat us to a market that we already have a 10-year head start on you, and you try to close the door in your domestic market, we'll close the door to your domestic market. Or we supply our companies in your domestic market with the graphite while we hold you from it. We're in a massive geopolitical space and we have to decide. I mean, does the whole world have the same opinion on whether we should electrify transportation? Does the whole country? There's going to be a lot of tough decisions to make. And we're coming off fossil fuels to drive vehicles. So we are moving out of the business of the western part of the country that contributes to the tax base to finance this. Which prime minister, which premier, which environment minister, which finance minister, which one is going to be the one that says, not in this term? And so it's a choppy road.
Yep.
You know, I'm the glass half empty person who builds electric cars and solar power plants, but it's not where what we need is candor.
Yeah.
And then decide, how do we get there?
So this is actually a great kind of point to go to the next segment, which is you're saying, what is the solution? And fortunately, we have very smart students that we asked this question, students at Ivy. So we had a competition as part of this theme of the 100 years for Ivy and the Symposium. And we've done a competition across all programs at Ivy, so MBA, HBA, MSc. And we actually we had 3 teams that won cash prizes, including $5,000 for the first place. And the winners are in attendance today. So first of all, I want to acknowledge the winners, Kashish Mittal, Kyle Edmonds, and Joseph Lau, who are here. Maybe you can stand up. So when you think about solution, we thought, let's ask them. They're the future leaders, going to help us get to 2050. I don't know where we're going to be in 2050, but I know they will have still more of a career then. So we wanted to show you, this is some of the solution that came out from all the different topics. So retrofitting gasoline vehicle with EV hardware, in-road dynamic charging, battery buffered EV charging, incentives such as toll exemption, and the EV for free campaign, allowing the free charging. But I want to share with you a short video that they prepared as part of their submission, which gives some ideas, and then based on that, I'm going to ask our esteemed panelists to react and think about the possible solutions.
The Canadian government has boldly set a goal: 60% of all vehicles sold in Canada to be electric by 2030. But if Canada fails to address the core issues surrounding electric vehicle adoption, it will fail to reach even half of its target by then. What if Canada could reshape its approach by creating a holistic strategy that redefines EV adoption and innovation? Introducing Evolution, a visionary initiative that transforms Canada's electric vehicle landscape. It creates a symbiotic ecosystem where dynamic in-road charging addresses infrastructure concerns, retrofitting extends the lifespans of vehicles and reduces costs, and the incentive and marketing program ensure widespread adoption and acceptance of these 2 solutions. Let's step into the not-too-distant future and meet Alex, a 35-year-old cafe owner residing in Toronto. She normally commutes around the city by bike, but also owns a 9-year-old Honda Civic for weekend trips to see family in London. Alex faces a dilemma when her trusty travel partner breaks down. Open to the idea of owning an EV, Honda has presented her with 2 options: buy a new EV or give the old car a new lease on life through retrofitting. This is where Evolution has stepped in, working in the background to simplify Alex's choice. With the planned opening of a second cafe, Alex is a bit tight on budget and is leaning towards the retrofitting program. And as fate would have it, Alex recalled seeing an ad about how the government recently completed in-road charging right along her route to London. No worrying about finding charging stations during family visits. While the allure of a brand new EV is strong, the practicality of retrofitting aligns better with Alex's circumstances. Opting for Honda's retrofit program, Alex not only gives the old car a new chapter, but is also able to own an EV, once thought unattainable with the higher initial costs. Evolution paves a road that connects Canada's aspirations, businesses, and families like Alex's. It's more than just a story. It's a glimpse of the choices Canadians could make as Evolution guides the nation towards a future where EV adoption is not a matter of if, but when. By reshaping its approach, Canada can surpass its goal and substantially increase EV's market share. Through the creation of retrofit programs and in-road dynamic charging, Canada is set to improve infrastructure, attract new EV owners, and drive innovation. Solve solutions are already seen as private organizations have laid the foundation. Michigan has struck a deal with Electrion to build public in-road charging systems. Renault has partnered with RFit to launch retrofit kits for some of its most popular models. With other countries starting to switch gears and take EVs more seriously, Canada must act now by addressing 3 key phases in its roadmap. Establishing a consortium to collectively drive research and development, work closely with regulatory bodies for partnerships and policy frameworks, and continuously evaluate and iterate based on insights. If Canada embraces innovation and draws inspiration from the global stage, it can emerge as the leader in the EV industry.
All right. Thank you for that. And I want to throw, Rachel, so we heard half empty glass. I'm personally kind of, 30% full glass. So, even if it's worse. But so my question to you, and I want to highlight on something you said before, which you also heard this morning, kind of, I would say first, the goal of government or the role of government in this, and sometimes the private sector has to kind of, go faster. And I think we had a chat before, and one of the things we heard earlier from Linda was, and there was a question in the CEO panel about, well, aren't we going kind of, too slow because we have to wait until we have enough, for example, the grid is ready for us to start with EVs and so on. And I talked to you earlier and you said, well, even if the grid is not ready, EVs could still be a solution. So I'm wondering if you can react to this and also think about the solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. So number one, congratulations, great video. And I had a stat that I'm actually quite enamored with that I will share with all of you. But 2 years ago, when we were looking at what the technologies we had to get to net zero, we had 50% of the technology and knew we still needed to advance 50% more innovation to get there. 2 years later, we have 66%. If you calculate that out, that means we have gotten 1% closer in technology and innovation every 45 days in the last 2 years, which is crazy and means that the smart people like yourselves who have been thinking in your career about how to get that into government policy adoption, how to really use innovation to complement some of these solutions that may look unattainable today, you have a bright career ahead of you, and congratulations for winning, well deserved. In my response, to the video, I would say, for me, there's problems about electric vehicle adoption in the light-duty vehicle space that are both real and perceived. And I think my colleagues have identified some real challenges, which are the charging network, and particularly when we're thinking about the majority of electric vehicle owners today have a dedicated parking space. I think that's about 85% of people who own electric vehicles. Tomorrow, we need to appeal to the people in the multi-unit residential buildings, the people who are living in rural communities and have real, legitimate concerns around their charging needs. There's a real challenge with the dominance of China historically in the supply chain and what they can do, to try to impact our ability as Canada to benefit economically from the transition. I think those are two both very legitimate and real challenges. But I think in the electric vehicle space, things have changed so fast that we can't keep track of which things are even based on the accurate information. So, recently Electric Mobility Canada polled both people who owned EVs and people who didn't. For starters, people who own EVs, 88% of them will never buy another fossil fuel powered vehicle because they think it's a superior product and they're happy with their experience. So that people who have had the best experience are satisfied. When going through a list of other things like how far do electric vehicles go, what's the charge, how many chargers are there in Canada, people would consistently underestimate and probably based on very accurate information 4 years ago. And so when they find out that an electric vehicle goes over 400 kilometers today with a charge, and you could make it then from Toronto to London and back, like a few times, their willingness, you got 20% of people after being given some accurate information who were all of a sudden willing to consider an electric vehicle as their next vehicle. So to me, some of the challenge is this perceived challenge. And where are the nodes in the system where people are able to get that accurate information? And is it at dealerships? Is it from their friends and family because people actually know these things? Who's the trusted sources to share these legitimate pieces of information? And then where are the innovation pieces that we'll need to solve those remaining challenges? I think in Canada, we will legitimately continue to have charging challenges, and figuring out what that charging network that will serve rural communities is a major challenge for the next 12 years. For me, making sure people are aware that the average person goes 60 kilometers and your battery goes 400 goes a ways to helping defray some of that concern and realize what is that intentional network that Rasika, you were talking about? Where does it need to be? And how are people going to use and engage with it? And how's it signed so people even know that it's there? So I think in-road charging, the countries that are looking at right now, I actually think your two solutions are going to prove really exciting for medium and heavy duty vehicles that are the next challenge, because those are going to need big batteries to go along major routes, road to road. I think they're really expensive to buy, so retrofitting becomes a really more reasonable kind of cost comparator. And I think a lot of the pilot projects that are being done on retrofitting are for these big diesel trucks. I'll be interested to see if it takes off in the LDV space. Interestingly, one of the reasons governments, I think, like supporting the electric vehicle space is all the jobs that go into parts and other manufacturing. So buying new vehicles, helps support an ecosystem of jobs. But I would say, yeah, very exciting. And maybe just to respond, Gal, on your original opening point, I think there's a lot of these kind of myths and facts that circulate, and maybe just responding to our conversation before on the grid. I think, some concerns that people have are even like, if I'm doing this for environmental purposes, am I actually solving anything? Leaving aside the affordability and the better vehicle. And so just to relate the fact I said to you is that studies in the US and Canada have looked at no matter how fossil fuel intense your grid is, an electric vehicle, because it's more efficient. You're not turning heat to power, you're just going straight from power to power. You are still going to have overall emissions benefits from the electric vehicle, even on a less clean grid. So in Canada, of course, you can get up to 89% more efficient in a place like Quebec. But even in a place like Alberta, whose current grid is not as clean, it's still more efficient to drive an electric vehicle from an emission standpoint in that kind of cradle to grave study. So how we get, again, those trusted people kind of spreading that message so we can focus on the real problems and not maybe the perceived problems is, to me, one of the keys.
Thank you. Rasika?
Sure, I'm more 30% like yourself as well. So I think when I think about the role of government to ask that question in relation to what I saw in that video, which is great, by the way, I think we should always just look at, like, certain things are still transferable from what we're dealing today with ICE cars and when we get to electric cars. So for instance, dynamic in-road charging. I mean, just look at how road infrastructure even for today's vehicles work, right? And we still can't get a clear timeline on when that Eglinton light rail is going to be complete, right? So maybe I wouldn't put our scarce government dollars there. What I would focus on, like I mentioned before, is at the end of the day, we need a sustainable demand for a product. Any company has a social obligation to its investors to be profitable, right? So it's healthy planet, healthy profit, and happy people. And so people want clean, livable cities. You've heard earlier, electric cars are just superior technology. And I look at Volkswagen, we went from the e-Golf, which we talk about affordability, but I have an interesting anecdote. When Ontario government had $14,000 incentives stackable with the feds, our e-Golf was cheaper than our gas Golf at the time, right? So we knew what does price parity look like back even then, right? And it was still, an infrastructure discussion. But I look at the range improvements that have happened from just when we launched our e-Golf, a short while ago, to our Volkswagen ID4 today. Right, so we're past the range anxiety. I want to debunk that myth, and the range is going to continue to improve. So we already have vehicles today that will get us from the Greater Toronto area to Montreal area. But what I think the role of government really is on the infrastructure piece. Like I said, the charging infrastructure. One thing you might not know is that 350 kilowatt chargers I mentioned that we need for the convenience factor. There's two main barriers to having a profitable business case for that in Canada. And Canada's going to have a harder time because one of them relates to the amount of traffic, and we're just a less populated country, right? And were spread out over three main urban areas. So it's called utilization, but you need a certain amount of traffic actually using those chargers for them to drive the profit. And before, in the gas world, you never had to wonder if the oil companies had a business case for their gas stations. We're in a world where it's actually hard to pencil a business case to build a fast charging station. So we need to know, and we need good data so that we know where are Canadians actually driving, so that you get the critical volume you need for that utilization. And then the other piece that's critical for that profitable business case is demand charges. So and that requires more innovative electricity rate structures in our provinces, which, they're not easy to fix in our provincial regulatory schemes right now, but we have seen some, like BC Hydro, Hydro-Quebec, have done some experimental innovative rates on level 3 charging for DCFC. So we need more of that level of thinking to really make it so that people want to invest in the infrastructure if you want to see private sector invest beyond government.
Yeah, love you. You've seen both the private side and the government side kind of working very closely. So.
Sure, let me say first on that project, who was one of you was the narrator there? That was you got a radio voice.
You have maybe another future also.
Yeah, nice and calm voice. The most important piece of that project is the critical thinking on it. You're highlighting some technologies that do have a play. And the question on whether they have a play is whether they have a return on investment either for public or private. I think some of those pieces will bear out. Somebody asked me yesterday at an event, hey, listen, I really like my car. What about, when can I rely on the OEM to give me a conversion kit? And I said, well, I think the conversion kit is worth more than your car. So your answer is they're going to sell you a new car. OEMs aren't that solution, but there could be an industry, which is an auxiliary industry, that says on limited models where a motor would fit where the engine is, and there's enough space within the architecture, maybe of the transmission tunnel, they might say, we're going to convert 2002 to 2011 Honda Civics for $9,000. That's good. All that stuff is about critical thinking, and we go back to what's the first principle on EVs. Nobody cares about EVs. Government doesn't care about EVs. The government cares about its carbon targets and its emissions targets. And I spent a lot of time, probably the biggest public defender and evangelist on the industry. I spent more time defending a Volkswagen investment that was $13 billion than the CEO of Volkswagen, because I believe there's a return there, and we actually have to do our part. If we believe in EVs, I'm going to represent companies that sell you parts from EVs, and I got to go out and defend that in a very competitive space where there's 1,000 competing interests in Canada, and we run deficits. And there's an opposition that doesn't want the Prime Minister to have a win, so I'm out there doing that. But carbon is the issue, not cars. Cars are part of the portfolio of things you look at to eliminate the production and the release of carbon. I'll leave you one anecdote that, from your own company. I do a lot of work with Porsche, a Volkswagen sub, an incredibly influential sub of Volkswagen whose applied technology is extremely reputable. Said, hey, by the way, what are we going to do with all these men, mostly men, who are driving around in these old 911s that are increasing in asset value? If we switch to electric, we're abandoning our return market. Why don't we try to figure out a way to create synthetic fuel that burns 95% less rate of carbon than a regular unit of fuel? Figured it out. Figured out the technology. I'm not sure they figured out the business case yet. Figured out the technology as part of a group that makes 9 million cars a year, or has the capacity for 9 million cars a year. I think part of that 100% EV sales is going to be replaced by companies that are going to stay in internal combustion but are going to use synthetic fuels. In a very short summary, the way that this synthetic fuel business works is using a hydrogen process, capture carbon, put it into a liquid form, put it through, and you combust it that way. If the target is reduction of carbon, and that you could do that with a real return on investment, you're going to do that. Lamborghini, who some of you might own one in this room, everybody looks so nicely dressed. They were, I'm the only guy in jeans here. They said they were going to build a hypercar to compete with other hypercars of all those other great car companies that are internal combustion, but they're going to do it electric. Well, they just announced last week that they've put pause on their electric hypercar, their $3 and $4 million version to run up against Rimac, which is the world's greatest car, some electric car made by some kid in Croatia, who then took Bugatti off Volkswagen's hands. I mean, it's insane. But this division said, with the advancements in synthetic fuels, we're going to wait. Because the core objective around the world for all the governments who are looking to solve something with electric vehicles isn't because they recognize that electric vehicle as a product is superior. We have to reduce the carbon footprint. And if the shorter path is an alternative, they'll get there. If Volkswagen Group, I'm not speaking on your behalf here, but if Volkswagen Group has solved for that, all those Chinese companies that we're competing with will solve for that, and the Japanese companies will solve for that. And so we just have to think critically now. Do we like electric vehicles? Or do we like carbon reduction? And you got to remember which lane you're in. I don't know which lane I'm in day to day. This is how tough this space is. Somebody else may solve it for you. And what's important as a student is just think critically. Don't get married to a technology. Get married to an objective. And we could all be talking about synthetic fuels that you can drink because they're so clean 10 years from now.
So it solves all the problem. You get stuck with a car, you just take some drinks, you know.
Well, I'll say this is what you...
Now it's glass full.
Now that's the, yeah.
Now you're the optimist, kind of. So
Let me just finish with one thing. The concern for Canadian industries, industrial partners is, well, we're going to invest whole hog into electric vehicle powertrains because we have to. But boy, if you go all the way and your balance sheet is heavy in that space, and we find another U-turn, then you're in trouble.
So, I mean, this reminds me, actually, I think it was a CEO of Honda in your conference that says, we have no problem with the government telling what the goals are, but we wanted to kind of decide how to get there. And this kind of, to me is kind of, very similar. So I should say, I told Darren originally, you really think in 40 minutes we'll be able to discuss EVs with this amazing 3 panelists? We need like 2.5 hours for that. So, but unfortunately, there is another session. So I think I'm going to have to stop kind of the discussion here. I could have stayed here for much longer. And I want to invite the winners of the kind of student to come give some gifts to our panelists. And I want to really thank you. This has been a wonderful discussion. And hopefully we can continue it kind of another.